I'm here today with Rana Foroohar from Time magazine to discuss her new book, Makers and Takers, The Rise of Finance and the Fall of American Business. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What is this stuff you call financialization?
Well, it's kind of a long, wonky term. It's been used by academics for a number of decades now to describe both the growth in size and power of the financial sector in our economy. So it's about 7% now of GDP. That's almost tripled in the last 40 years. So it's really grown in size. But it's also about the shift in business model. So if you look back, say, to the 1970s, banks were, mainly taking deposits, lending them out to business, which is, kind of how the financial system was envisioned to have worked by Adam Smith. You take everybody's money, you lend it out to productive businesses, they create jobs and growth in the economy. Well, if you look now, and this is sort of one of the real killer stats in the book, some work by a couple of academics, Alan Taylor and Maurice Schullerich, found that only 15% of the financial flows coming out of the biggest institutions in the U.S. are now going to business investments. So that is a big shift in what the financial system does.
And I should say Taylor and Schullerich are INET grantees,
oh,
so
okay,
we're very
great.
proud to hear you
glad I
promoting their
name-checked
work. And of course, Adair Turner's also written about this, how much of credit
Absolutely.
allocation is channeled into things like collateralized real estate and not into things that directly translate into productivity growth.
Absolutely. In fact, his book, Between Debt and the Devil, is one that I name-checked in mine, and he was a big source, as was Andy Haldane at the Bank of England. And it's interesting because a lot of the best sources, aside from the INET folks, were Brits. And, the process of financialization has arguably gone even farther in some ways in the UK. So it's interesting. I think they've got some very smart thinking there.
Yes, but one thing they have that's somewhat different is their money politics.
Well, that's for sure. And that's another thing that I talk about in the book, actually. The last chapter gets into the financial lobby and essentially the post-crisis narrative. I mean, why haven't things been fixed? Why do we have Dodd-Frank regulation, as much as it has done, also having been turned into Swiss cheese in some cases? Well, it's because the financial lobby threw a tremendous amount of money and effort at rolling back the provisions that they didn't like. And you can see it in the infamous example of Jamie Dimon actually getting involved in the 2014 budget bill and saying that the banking sector didn't like the certain loophole for derivatives and wanted it changed. So it's amazing. I could go on with examples like that, but it's really unprecedented in this country.
Well, you see the scale of money. Once in the Dodd-Frank hearings, I spoke for the Senate Agricultural Committee where the derivatives are regulated. And someone asked me, why is it that they will fight so fiercely? Why does this matter? And I quoted a study by Brad Hintz, a security analyst, where he said that the profit margin in derivatives would be reduced by 20% if you moved everything onto exchanges. What he essentially didn't say, or didn't translate into the politics, is that translated to about $7 billion a year. And if you have a bill every 5 years, that meant $35 billion was at stake. So the fact that they were putting up $600 million to what you might call influence this bill was relatively a good risk return for them. It's unfortunate that society has to endure those contorted results. But for them, it was a sound investment decision.
And that's absolutely right. And it's so interesting. You can see I charted finance tends to swap places with big pharma in terms of being one of the top one or two lobbying powers as an industry. And you can tell based on what piece of legislation is coming up, what the spending is going to be. One of the things that this really reflected in the book, I had a chapter on the housing sector and what happened in the housing market post-2008. And one of the fascinating things that's happened is a lot of risk, as we know, has migrated from the SIFIs, the structurally important institutions, into less regulated areas of the financial sector like private equity. And private equity is an area that I have a lot of concerns about, in part because post-2008 they were really able to capitalize on the crisis, going into the courthouse steps with all this cash, none of the rules about what kind of housing they would have to provide, buying up mortgages. And so you've got a situation where a private equity firm is now the largest owner of single-family housing in America. They are the largest landlord in America. And you're hearing community groups start to complain about how tenants are being treated, about people not being able to get in touch with their landlord, not even knowing who they are, complex computerized systems, not to mention all the practices in the private equity sector that we know are so problematic.
Yeah, and that bridges on to the frontier again of politics, which is large concentrated firms in the financial sector, or any sector for that matter, can have a disproportionate influence on the politics, particularly in a state or local region where they own a lot of the real estate.
Sure enough. I mean, just one number that I would love to call out that I think captures the monopoly power of the financial sector in general. Finance in America represents about 4% of all jobs, roughly 7% of GDP, but takes a quarter of all corporate profits. So if you kind of need any better example of monopoly power, I don't know what it would be.
Well, I would also say that when you look at the distribution of income, what they call the 1% is disproportionately CEOs of corporations who use financial engineering in conjunction with their favorite investment banker to extract wealth from the company and the financial services people themselves. And that's a very large proportion. There are a few star athletes in there and a couple of actors and actresses, but
well, it's interesting. I mean, this kind of touches on some of the work that Piketty and others have publicized so well, just the power of capital in terms of returns relative to ordinary income is something that it's just fuel on the fire for all of this. And it dovetails, the relationship between the C-suite and the financial sector really dovetails with the problem of short-termism in the markets that we've been grappling with in the last few years. The lead of my book actually is not about a bank, it's about Apple and the fight between Apple and activist investor Carl Icahn over the last few years. I did a big profile on Icahn for Time magazine a while back, and he had just started getting into social media, and so he was tweeting, every 5 minutes telling Apple to give more dividend payments and buybacks to investors, and of course that jacks the share price up every single time, and that would make Icahn a few more millions. I'm not quite sure what his stake was, but what was so ironic about it is Apple had tons of money. It was being held offshore, a lot of free cash flow. They had, about 10% of all of corporate America's liquid assets at that point. Most of it, as we know, in tax havens. They're tax optimizing, not wanting to pay the U.S. rate, but yet using the debt markets here to borrow roughly the same amount, that money then being paid out to, let's call it generously the top 20% that owns 80% of the stock, but really disproportionately the 1%. So you have this cycle where the capital markets are being used to exacerbate inequality. And by the way, just as a caveat, this is all being done by a firm. If you look at their products, most of the parts that are smart in the smartphone were developed by the U.S. government. So that's a whole nother conversation we can have.
They just didn't hold on to the royalties, did they?
You can get Mariana Mazzucato in here to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think this is an interesting phenomenon. The subtitle of your book, The Rise of Finance and the Fall of American Business. I would have thought from that subtitle that the non-financial corporate world would be somewhat up in arms about how much finance is extracting, as you talk about, a quarter of corporate profits and disproportionate share of GDP relative to the employment share. All of these dimensions would suggest there would be a battle, and which you might say the political economy would have a leveling effect. But we're not seeing much of that from the top management of corporations. They're not protesting the excesses of finance.
No, and in fact, you see groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce putting out notes saying, well, buybacks are really not all that bad. And, this way in which the financialized system that we have funnels wealth up to the top of the C-suite. Well, of course, it enriches boards. It basically dictates, unfortunately, a decision-making process that puts more money in investors' pockets, but actually does not channel capital productively into places that are actually going to fuel underlying growth. And I think, to be fair, I think there are certain enlightened CEOs that are starting to get worried about this. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing people start to talk about the short-term problem now. But one of the funny things, I thought when I wrote this book that I was going to get calls from Fortune 500 CEOs saying, "Yay, go! You know, you're writing a book that's exposing how much pressure we're under." In fact, just the opposite. You know, everybody kept their heads below the parapet. I did get calls, interestingly, from certain numbers of enlightened financiers, hedge funders, particularly people in London who really are worried about the underlying growth issues inherent in this problem, because we have tons of data now from the BIS and the IMF and lots of different bodies to suggest that when finance reaches a certain size as a percentage of the economy, the underlying growth does start to slow.
Yeah, I remember a paper that was released at our Women in Finance conference.
Yeah, exactly.
From the IMF.
That's right,
exactly
that's right.
Theme,
and it was on emerging markets, too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But it's an interesting phenomenon because you see corporate executives in the business of personal wealth extraction,
right,
with a partner from the financial sector,
yeah,
not necessarily to the benefit of their own stockholders,
no,
or to the long-term benefits or investment in R&D or broadening the strength of their franchise.
No, and you can see that in the data too. I mean, you can make an X with rise of finance since the 1980s, growth in buybacks and sort of financialized methods of corporate governance, fall in R&D spending as a percentage of revenue, fall in per capita startup activity, and all kinds of measures of entrepreneurial zeal in the economy are going down. So, you know, really, even though it's difficult to make precise, causal connections because of just what kind of a complex ecosystem we're talking about, it's really clear that those trends have run in tandem.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is I know people like Bill Lazonick have done a lot of work documenting.
He was a big source in the book too.
At the new economy, so to speak, starting with Hewlett-Packard and IBM in the older days, but the ICT sector.
Yeah.
But you look at this, and you'd say, as you know, Warren Buffett and others used to say, well, after a point, if you don't have any real high productivity things to do with the money, it's not a bad idea to give it back to the stockholders. But the question is, if that intermediate layer, what in economics we call the principal agent problem, where the management is creating stock buybacks to support the stock they want to sell for their personal wealth, then the whole, we might call longer vision, is compromised.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up that point, actually, because I spoke to Warren Buffett about this, and he made that point. I know that he and others support buybacks, for this reason. If you have a company like Apple, they've got all this cash on the balance sheet, why not? But one of the issues, and Lazonick points this out in his research, when you see buybacks being made, it's almost always at the top of the market. It's about what companies do when they don't have an underlying growth strategy and they want to get just that little bit extra of goosing to the stock in order to put more money in the pockets of the C-suite. If it was actually about, okay, we don't see anything productive to do with this money right now, but we believe in our stock and we're gonna support, well, then you wouldn't be seeing those buybacks happening way at the top of the market. You'd be seeing them happening at a different price point.
Yeah, there'd be a counterweight, counter-cyclical investment strategy.
Yeah, so I'm skeptical of that rationale.
Let's talk about a crisis that may be looming on the horizon. You talked about the short-termism. You talked about corporate, CEO compensation and other things. What's left over for the company affects how pension returns will be realized many years hence. So we're in a situation now where yields are low. People are concerned about compounding for life insurance and pension. It's almost like a bleeding insolvency rather than a rupture. It's a slow process. But those people who say pensioners are paid too much have to wonder if the problem is that the pensioners were promised too much, or whether the system of governance can manage to discipline the investment process and the fund managers, particularly when the large hedge funds and private equity funds have done a very good job of creating war chests for pension fiduciaries to eventually run for governor,
Yeah.
pay-to-play schemes on the side, and other things. And so what's going on inside the specific contracts in the pension, what's going on in the equity market with wealth extraction for top corporate management,
Yes.
cumulatively, and I think you said, what's the mathematics of this over 30 or 40 years? This can be a very, very substantial drain on the wealth creation that pensioners and therefore municipalities and states are counting on.
Absolutely. In some ways, it's hard to know where to even start with talking about the ways in which the pensions crisis intersects with financialization. You've got the political economy issues. You've got wild conflicts of interest in terms of, the pension funds being embedded with different local governments. And that's always been the case. I mean, I think the collapse of Detroit has a lot to do with the ways in which you had a very gullible party and a much sort of savvier party that were just not in an equal negotiation. But I'll come back to that maybe in a minute. But, I have a whole chapter on the coming retirement crisis in the book. And I actually start out with the fact that the entire 401k system really isn't working for the majority of Americans. It's working for a certain amount of rich. You then have a pension system where retirees have been overpromised. I mean, they've been promised things like 8% returns. We know in this environment, you're going to be lucky to get 4. You might get 2. I mean, you have 30% of the world's debt paying out negative interest rates. And so when I look ahead, barring anything that we really just can't see, goosing growth in some tremendous way, this is a looming crisis that I would think would create populism of a kind that we have not even seen yet. I mean, when you think about people realizing that they may get negative returns on investments that they've been overcharged for, sold a bill of goods on, they've been invested in risky assets, it's a real crisis.
So, and the question I think will be, what kind of new political energy, as you talk about a looming crisis, how will it be generated? Through institutions?
Yeah.
Will it be the public at large? Will it be the kind of populism that's been associated with Sanders?
Yeah.
Or the Trump phenomenon that we see in this election cycle?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Bernie Sanders, and I think that he did a great service by bringing this issue to the fore. I think that his vision of the financial system was not nearly as nuanced and sophisticated as it might have been. But I think that people are starting to understand something important, which is that, hey, this is our financial system. This is not just the realm of technocrats that speak in acronyms that nobody can understand. Debates, we can have debates about, what tier 1 capital ratio everybody should be holding till the cows come home. That's actually not the most important question. The most important question is, how do we structure a financial system that actually provides an economic and social good? And that's one of the things that I was really trying to do in my book is make it clear that the easy question, the basic question, is the right question. Finance is supposed to be a helpmeet for business. It is not supposed to be the top of some kind of economic pyramid that we're all supposed to be aspiring to. It is not special. That's something that Anat Admati, who wrote The Banker's New Clothes, has made very clearly that banks shouldn't be treated specially. It's not like they have some special business model that requires them to do business with 90% debt all the time. And it's okay for average people, for concerned citizens, to be in here asking these questions. I think that one of the things that was so destructive post-2008 is the debate got hijacked by a lot of experts who said, we all have it under control, tried to embarrass people who asked questions about, what might be going on that were maybe too simplistic. And it wasn't under control. It's not under control. And I think that we need to actually, particularly for such a metric-driven business, we should start asking for different metrics, not just what are you doing wrong and how are we going to regulate against it, but what are you doing right? Let's see some numbers about that, and then let's incentivize that.
Yeah, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And,
there you go.
But I think you're really onto something here, which is we're in a period now where expertise is on trial.
That's true.
Because it's not viewed as a dispassionate scientific description of what's happening to society.
Yeah.
It's viewed as marketing for the powerful. But I think you've done, you've created a great trampoline for people who would like to get into this realm of scrutiny, and the quality of the data and information and the quality of the exploration, I think, has been a great service. So
Well, thank you for
thanks
your
for writing
help.
it.
Thanks for INET's help, and thanks for jumping on the trampoline with me.